Hello and welcome to another episode of the Northern Art Podcast with me, Ant Cosgrove. Hope you're all doing very well indeed. Summer is here, which means the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in London. My last guest, Michael Ashcroft, was successful in getting his work into the show. This year, the Royal Academician Coordinator is David Renfrey. The team involved is David, Eileen Cooper, Catherine Jones, Bill Jacklin, Tim Shaw and Peter Barber. I'm hopefully going to get over to it, see it at some point over the summer. I met David Renfrey in Lincoln too recently during his solo exhibition at the Usher Gallery. David did a talk with Martin Gayford, and so we met up in Lincoln just prior to that. He's such a really nice guy, and his partner Caroline is lovely too. In fact, my mum came along and she loved it as well. So yeah, it was a good break actually. There is an interesting looking exhibition on at the Hepworth Wakefield at the moment. This features the barbershop work of the artist Hervin Anderson. Hervin has also created a separate exhibition of works from public collections that he feels are formative influences. This features works from the artists like Michael Andrews, Francis Bacon, Claudette Johnson, Leon Kosov and many more. The Michael Andrews painting is Melanie and Me Swimming from the late 1970s, and it's one of the best British paintings of the 20th century in my opinion. I love it. It's from the Tate collection and it's been loaned to the Hepworth. The show runs until the 5th of November 2023, so yeah, be good to go and check that one out. So, let's move on to my guest today. My guest today is the great-nephew of the Hungarian Jewish artist George Mayer-Marton. George was born in 1897 and was a significant figure in Viennese art between the First and Second World Wars. He came to England in 1938 to flee the Nazis and lived in London and then in Liverpool. He produced important mosaics in several churches, and I know that my guest has been instrumental in preserving one of these. I love George's paintings and his mosaics, so I'm really looking forward to learning more about him today and his work. So, without further ado, my guest on the Northern Art Podcast today is Nick Braithwaite. Hi Nick, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, not bad at all. Whereabouts? One thing I was wondering with you, Nick, where actually are you in the world?
I live in South London.
Right, interesting. Right, because obviously with the connections of recently with George and things that have happened in the news, and it's all in the north, isn't it? It's all sort of in the north.
Yeah, it tends to be, yeah. My name is actually Northern, but my family came to London in 1938, so
right, okay.
Ever since.
You've been there ever since.
Apart from George, it popped up north.
Yes. Well, I know obviously, like I say, you've got connections with the church, which was in Oldham particularly in more recent times, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. But when did you first learn that you had a relative who had been like this amazing, great artist, or was it something that you just always knew from being just forever? You've not known any different? Is that how it was?
When I was about 2 or 3, I used to stay over with my sister in my grandmother's house in South Croydon, and the spare room was crammed to the gunnels with oil paintings and a huge easel. I had no idea really who this artist was. And, a lot of the pictures were extremely indecipherable to me. They, as I now know, they were sort of cubist in flavor, quite a lot of them. So I didn't really give it a lot of attention. And I can remember my mother and grandmother kind of talking away in German, referring to someone called Der Jury. And I thought it was something to do with Jukebox Jury, which was a TV program at the time.
Right.
And then sort of gradually it sort of filtered through to me that my grandmother had lost her brother a few years before, and
right.
Everybody missed him a lot, and he was obviously a very significant figure in their lives.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So over the years, my grandmother did a lot of work kind of sorting out her inheritance of these pictures, placing a lot of them with public institutions. And then my mother developed that work as well. So eventually, in some way, the baton fell to me.
Right. Okay. Interesting. That's really interesting because, of course, your mother helped with a mosaic, didn't she? That was in Liverpool, which was one of George's works that had been commissioned by the church, which we will talk about a bit later on. But in particular, this particular one in Liverpool was in a church. I'm rubbish at remembering the names of the churches, by the way. But it was in a church in Liverpool, and then it was under risk of being possibly destroyed. Could you take up the story with that? Then what happened with that?
Yeah, the church was in Netherton. Okay. It was a mosaic of the Pentecost.
Right.
Actually, very, very beautiful work. And my mother got notice from the Catholic Church in Liverpool that the building was about to be demolished. So she kind of sprang into action. And within the space of 6 weeks, she'd organized the quite complicated procedure with the help of a lot of friends, actually, and colleagues.
Yeah.
Of taking this mosaic down tessera by tessera, i.e. each individual bit by bit.
That's incredible.
and then it was stored, and eventually they found a space in Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral,
Right.
which in some ways looked as if it was made for that work.
Yeah.
So it's still there today, but it was a remarkable achievement on her part.
Yeah, that's amazing that she did that. I mean, I guess did the church just go there? Is it? I mean, I'm assuming it's probably been demolished then, hasn't it? The church, the original church.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's been demolished, right? Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, we'll talk about, like I say, more about his work later on and everything. That was obviously that was the time that he was in Liverpool at that point. But from the beginning, really, he was born in 1897. Do you know much about like his early life? Have you got any knowledge of his parents or anything like that?
Yeah, they belonged to, well, he belonged to an assimilated professional family. Father was a dental physician.
Okay.
They lived in a provincial city or town in Western Hungary, just near the Austrian border, called Győr.
Sure. I wondered how to pronounce that. I saw it written down. I had no idea how to pronounce it.
My grandmother used to teach me how to pronounce it, so it's the only word I can pronounce properly in Hungarian, I think. So it's like Győr.
Yeah.
So in those days, it was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It was called Raab.
Okay.
It's on the banks of the Danube. He was one of 4 children. My grandmother was his younger sister. Elder brother Pista was killed in the First World War. He served on the Eastern Front for the Austro-Hungarian army from 1916 onwards.
Yes.
At the tender age of 19. He actually wrote a First World War diary, which I've been having a look at recently.
Oh, that's interesting.
Written in Hungarian. And then when he came back from the war, I guess to some extent pretty traumatized by his experiences.
Yeah.
He decided to study art.
Right.
My mother always said that he came bottom in his art class at school, which should give us all some encouragement. So he studied first in Vienna, which was a sort of, the nearby cultural powerhouse.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And then he got dissatisfied with the teaching there, so he went to study in Munich.
Right, okay.
Under a professor called Doerner, Doerner.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that was 1919 to 1924, I think it was, wasn't it? And that sort of, I think around that sort of time, he was studying.
Round about then, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I know that he visited was it Ravenna in Italy, which must have been like really inspiring for his work later on as well. Right. With regards to the mosaics.
I don't have a lot of information about that. I mean, I know he was in Ravenna, and you can see from his reconstructed workbook where he was exactly when he was doing particular pictures.
Yeah.
I don't have any detail about his studies, except that he was always quite keen on mural and in particular mosaic.
Right, interesting. And then he settled in Vienna in 1927, and he was involved in like a really sort of progressive art. The Hagenbund, I think it was what it was called, which was the most progressive sort of group of Viennese artists. And he eventually became vice president, didn't he, of that? And that was a sort of really important group. And he must have been in contact with some really leading, artists of the day, I would have thought, during that time.
Yeah, he was actually there from 1923, so he was
right. Okay.
Hagenbund had been going since the early 20th century. They used to meet in this, well, initially in a cafe called Sperl in Vienna, and then after that in a cafe called Hagen, owned by the eponymous Herr Hagen.
Okay.
And some pretty big names were members of the Hagenbund, like Egon Schiele.
Wow.
Oskar Kokoschka.
Oh wow! Okay,
but that was a little bit before George.
Right.
So his contemporaries were people like George Ehrlich, George Merkel was his closest colleague, Carrie Hauser, who was president when George was vice president. So in Vienna, these are big names, but they don't really travel abroad very well.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, during that period of his life, it seemed to be, obviously he'd come back from the First World War, but things seemed to, for his career purpose, it seemed to be going on a really upward trajectory, and he was a big name. It looked, I mean, I read that he'd had like he was involved in over 40 national and international exhibitions. Obviously he knew all these artists, and so he was doing well for himself, basically. Wasn't he involved in the Olympics or something at one point?
Yeah. In those days, the Olympics had a painting competition.
Right.
And all I've been able to find out is that he did take part on behalf of Austria, but he was apparently disqualified for some reason. And I have a sort of sneaking suspicion that the reason is because he was Hungarian, which is a bit of a problem.
And he got rumbled. Right, okay, interesting. No, it's yeah. So, like I say, it must have been, things were going obviously really right for him at that point. And I know obviously time changed as everybody in the world knows, but it was that the group ended, I think, in 1938 as a result of the Nazis calling the work sort of, and the artists involves as decadent art, and then I think it was degenerate art was the sort of the term that people more commonly know it as, and they effectively shut it down.
Actually, the word they used was verjudet, which means, I guess it means like infested with Jews.
Oh God, right.
Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah, charming. And then, of course, many of the Jewish members of the group, including George, fled and sort of had to, they had to sort of up sticks and leave, really, which obviously is what happened. I mean, just to describe his work, because obviously that's where we are now in the story kind of thing, in that we're sort of leaving Hungary and Vienna behind. His work itself, you can look at it visually as a painter, and you can see influences of Cubism, can't you, in the work, without a doubt. I've read people possibly neo-romantic as well in that sort of sense, whereas in like the 1920s, kind of neo-romanticism was kind of a mixture of romantic era painting, but also modernist ideas as well. And I can sort of see that in his work. He was very much at the forefront, I think, of what was going on in art at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't profess to be an art historian, so you have to take everything I say with a pinch of salt. I mean, I can see kind of Cubist influences on his work in Vienna.
Yeah.
There are also kind of pastoral, sort of Arcadian influences somewhere.
Okay.
But I think a lot of that is a reaction to the First World War. So you get this sort of sense that he's just enjoying being alive and sort of drinking in the beautiful sunshine of southern Italy or Croatia or Istria or Dalmatia. There isn't a lot of kind of disturbance in his work at that time. And the other members of the Hagenbund are to greater or lesser extents, similarly developing themes like that. I think he is particularly, amongst the Hagenbund members, he's particularly drawn to landscape. That's his sort of big personal thing. Yeah.
No, it's interesting to talk about his work. I mean, he also wrote poetry as well. Is that right? He poetry, which is interesting as well. Does much of that survive?
Quite a bit? Yeah. There's work in Hungarian and in German, which was his second language, and also in English towards the end of his life. In fact, right at the end of his life, he was writing on his deathbed in hospital.
Right. Okay. Well, that's interesting. And then, so to go over to skip over to England now, I suppose that was 1938. Yeah. He came to England. So obviously, he must have been in his early 40s at that point. He was married. His wife, is it Greta, sorry, pardon. Greta was his wife, came over to England. She was a pianist, is that right? And then he came over as a picture restorer, I believe. That was sort of what he came over as. And then he moved into teaching, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, he couldn't really get any work as a picture restorer, as it turned out. So he was teaching in St John's Wood School of Art in St John's Wood.
Yeah,
as you might guess, for more or less a couple of years until 1940. So he and his wife were living in the studio in the garden of the school. And then in September 1940, in the first big air raid of the war, he was in St John's Wood Station with his wife, sheltering from the bombs. When he came back, he found that all his life's work basically had been destroyed, apart from a few paperwork that he'd been able to take in a suitcase into the air raid shelter. So that was pretty devastating.
Yeah, I mean, that's like such a moment, isn't it? Of course, I've discussed this with other people along the sort of way, and when you sort of think that he managed to flee from the persecution that he was threatened with in his homeland, come over here, bring all his work over here, manage to get it out and safely to here, and then for it to be destroyed in London, like, that is like curse or what. So it's
yeah. And I think one of the bitter ironies of it is that he was very meticulous and organized.
Yeah.
So I think he had lists of everything that he brought with him.
Okay.
But he was completely unable to get any insurance compensation because Lord Clark said it was worthless. And in fact, I've been doing some little bit of research about Lord Clark recently, so I'm going to be going into print on that.
Right. Okay. So yeah, like you say, he managed to salvage a few bits. Well, he had a few bits, didn't he, which were in his case and whatnot. And then so I guess at that point it's like starting afresh almost with no with no artwork behind him at that point. And yeah, it's just really sort of tragic moment. And I think his wife didn't quite recover from that sort of, but she sort of struggled, didn't she? I think after that.
Yeah, she had a breakdown after the destruction of the artwork.
Yeah,
she never really recovered from that. So she spent the rest of her life in a mental hospital.
Oh
and
gosh!
Died in 1951.
Right. Oh.
By her own hand.
Wow. And then, so obviously this was 1940. When did he start working for SEMA then? When was that?
I think around 1940.
Right. So that was the progression after the work had been lost. He managed to get he'd finished with the I guess maybe the job in the school had ended at that point.
The school had ended.
The school. Sorry. Okay, the school had ended, and sorry, and then he
the same place as the paintings, unfortunately.
Right. Okay, and then he I think I did read that. Was it your gran who discovered him by the painting, by the ashes of the work or something? Is that right?
Yeah. It's a funny story. I kind of hesitate to recount this story because it, in some ways, it slightly trivializes the gravity of it. But in the haste of getting into the air raid shelter, he'd borrowed a very loud checked suit from somebody.
Okay.
The kind of, because he had normally very conservative dress sense.
Yeah.
And my grandmother arrived following day and found him sifting through the rubble of the studio with tears streaming down his face. But he was wearing this very loud checked suit.
Right.
And she said, "Is that you or your astral body?" And they both burst out laughing. So it shows a certain resilience, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Right. So obviously, we didn't mention that before, but of course, George came over. So your grandmother must have come over at some point as well.
My grandmother and grandfather and my mother came over about 6 months after George.
Right.
Just after Kristallnacht.
Ah, right. I see. Okay.
On a visa. Yeah.
And so then, like I said, he worked for SEMA, which was the precursor to the Arts Council as we know it now. And in that job, which, like you say, he took it over in 1940, still living in London, I'm assuming at that point, he had to travel up and down the country as, I guess, a lecturer. And I'm assuming that meant the other thing with that is, I guess you wouldn't have necessarily had the time and the inclination perhaps to do much painting, I suppose, as well. I'm assuming he was painting, but perhaps not as much as he would have liked to have done, because that is probably a heavy job, that being a lecturer traveling all around the country. Yeah,
he did continue to paint. I think there was a bit of a pause after 1940, which was
of course to be expected with everything, of course, as well. Yeah.
And also, the other big feature is that he couldn't afford to paint in oil.
Right.
All his oil paints had been burned.
Okay.
So he actually wasn't able to paint in oil again until 1948.
Right.
So he was exclusively painting in watercolor.
Right.
So as he traveled up and down the country, my impression is, and I should probably write something about this sometime. And that there's actually been an interesting dissertation by Natasha Kumpelage about it. He's kind of working through his depression and sense of alienation through his watercolor painting. So for him, it's a very personal means of expression.
Yeah.
And you can see it very clearly in the pictures. He's kind of fighting against the sort of glumness of the English weather.
Yeah.
And then gradually you can just see the sunshine beginning to poke through around about 1942, 1943. So, he's a very resilient man, but I think he did suffer from depression.
Yeah.
And all the time, his wife was in a park.
Gosh, yeah, of course.
So I don't have a lot of detail about that, but
it's interesting. So he did date the works then. He did date them, so that's enabled you to sort of to look at this, I guess, as well as
Yeah, I mean, I can't identify all of them, and the watercolors are particularly hard to identify because the measurements aren't left in the workbook.
Right.
He meticulously reconstructed the workbook that had been destroyed in 1940.
Right.
So obviously some records had survived, but I don't know what he reconstructed it from.
Right.
And I've just sort of finished transcribing that workbook onto a spreadsheet. So that's a useful exercise for me because it helps me get into his mind a little bit more.
Yeah. That's interesting. So so like you say, because he was so meticulous and he's managed to keep records of things, he's been able to sort of recreate, like you say, some of the work, which was, that's interesting. Now in 1945, he painted a work which quite a stunning work really, which is a watercolor, which is called A Woman with Boulders, which is a really strong work, which is in the collection of the Imperial War Museum. I believe it was painted after he learned of the death of his parents.
Yeah, they were murdered in the final year of the war in Dürr. I think they were in hiding for a period in Dürr. Um, and I always believed that they'd perished in Auschwitz, but in fact, my great grandmother was beaten to death in the street
God.
by her fellow townsmen, and my grandfather died on a train on the way to Auschwitz.
Oh, bloody
My
hell.
great
So obviously he discovered this, and this work is, if anybody listening, you can see it online, and it's a really sort of powerful work, really, because it isn't necessarily an obvious work relation, but the power in it, in the two figures, the brooding sky and these boulders, and there's so much, there'll be symbolism in there, and it's just a really strong work, I think, in particular. And I think the standing woman's like holding a baby as well, holding a child, and the moorland, like I say, it's dotted with these boulders, and there's
a reference to Jewish ritual in there, right, placing a stone on the grave of the dead person,
right.
But that's the only instance where I think his Jewish identity sort of comes to the surface. I mean, essentially, he's a very assimilated individual.
Yeah,
yeah, in religious terms, at least.
Yeah, just to go back to his when he worked. So obviously he works for SEMA. I found something online which was quite interesting. He was involved in the Picasso exhibition that took place in Manchester, which was Picasso and Matisse, which was originally at the V&A, I believe, in London, and then it moved. It did eventually sort of come up to Manchester in 1946, I think it would have been. And so, yeah, it was just a really interesting sort of notion. And what I did read, because it's on, you can see it in the Guardian or wherever it was in the archives. So yeah, this show in Manchester was a continuation of the V&A show from 1945, and then George was sort of the main delegate, really, from the Arts Council, and he did talks during the show to the general public and to critical groups, schools and art groups from various northern towns. I mean, it was a really popular show. There was like 5,000 visitors on the first day, so there was queuing, down the street to see it. So it sort of shows you the sort of how he was thought of within that as an incredible sort of talker, speaker, and knowledgeable guy, really.
Yeah, I think that I didn't know that, so that's really interesting.
Yeah.
But before the war, he'd been a sort of very pivotal. I mean, quite apart from his artistic output, he was a very pivotal figure in the Hagenbund, right, just organising these exhibitions around Europe and in America, Spain, all over Germany.
Yeah.
So I think he picked up a lot of connections during that period, and also he was very sort of academically interested in what was going on.
Yeah, yeah.
Probably during the war, when he was traveling around, he had a lot of opportunity to kind of study and to sort of re-immerse himself in the history of art.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then was he eventually made redundant from that role then at some point?
In 1951.
Right, okay.
And his wife died in the same year.
Right, oh, right. And then that's when he moved up to Liverpool, a chance at a new life almost, to get out of what he'd been through and move away, and became the senior lecturer at the Liverpool Art College. And at that point, he would have been in his 50s, I think, or perhaps maybe something like that, maybe.
Yeah.
And so it's a it's a new start, and in that sense, and came up to Liverpool, and yeah, he was in that role, I think, until he died. But Liverpool at that point in the 50s, I mean, during the whole of the 50s, it's a really interesting place to have been anyway, artistically, because he sort of hit the right place to go to, I think, at that point, because it was a really interesting, and I think he was definitely a part of the reason it was so good, in that period. I think he definitely brought this element of modernism to Liverpool, which wasn't necessarily there before. And I'm assuming, well, in fact, I kind of I know really that one of his students would have been John Lennon in Liverpool, because John Lennon was at the art school. John Lennon was there in 1957, and then Stuart Sutcliffe, of course, who was the fifth Beatle, actually was definitely a student of George's, and actually wrote about it as well. In Stuart wrote about in his notes. I mean, I've got some comments here about him. He did sort of say how important he was, and with regards to colour concepts and perspective ideas and things like that. And so yeah, it's just interesting that he was involved in that sort of scene in Liverpool, and I think that I'd have this discussion sometimes with Peter Davis, the author, who wrote a very interesting book called Liverpool Scene. If anybody's not read that, it's a really good book, which George is featured in a little bit in there. And there's a chapter on John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe. But we do talk about this sometimes with Liverpool. At that point was because maybe George was a missing link for this what I'm about to say now. Liverpool was kind of looking outwards towards Europe more and the art world in that sort of sense, whereas Manchester, which is down the road, which is where I'm from, was definitely looking more internally at itself and looking at the local scenes and the painting locally and being taught that with the perhaps, and sort of certainly in when you read the reviews of the art exhibitions from the Manchester Academy and stuff, the critics were constantly on at them to paint paint your local scenes, paint this, that, and the other, and obviously that came off the back of it. You have Lowry as well as the main sort of guy at that point, who people were looking to. Liverpool didn't have a Lowry, and so Liverpool was perhaps maybe more looking externally, and somebody like George coming in with all these ideas of Europe and Cubism and modernism and all these sort of concepts would have been like, wow, who is this guy? And so so I think it's interesting. I think he would have been a star at Liverpool, to be honest with you, I can imagine. So there you go, that's my little speech.
Well, I think perhaps the difference between Liverpool and Manchester is, that Liverpool was probably a little, because it was a port and slightly more outward looking.
Yeah.
It's probably a very wise choice for him because it was probably going to be more receptive to him.
Yeah.
Whereas London in those days was extremely stuffy and conservative as far as the art world was concerned.
Right. That's
but I think that was one of the factors why he left.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, he was a great teacher there. I know that. He taught, he lectured and whatnot, but he taught violin as well. What a guy! Is that?
I wasn't aware of that.
I believe I read somewhere he taught violin. I mean, I don't know if that's right. Is that? Did you know he was a musician? Is that what?
Yeah, I knew he was a musician, and I have one of his violins.
Oh right, okay, yeah. So I must be on the right track with that. So I'm sure I heard he taught violin.
I knew he played chamber music, but I assumed it was on an amateur basis.
Right. Okay.
And his wife, who was a professional pianist, didn't have a very high opinion of his playing.
Okay.
which I've inherited, unfortunately.
It might have been a few little small classes he had for violin, then maybe it wasn't that serious a thing. But I did read that somewhere. And so he taught that, and then of course one of the things that he did as well was set up a mural class in Liverpool, which was like the first of its kind in the country. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's just incredible. I mean, obviously that will lead on to the other sort of the rest of the conversation with regards to the murals and stuff. But I think at that point, from him being in Liverpool to the end of his life, was a time where he could paint because he had a studio. So he was teaching, and then he would have had the time to paint. He wasn't traveling. He was obviously concentrating on producing these artworks. And so there's something like 200 oils, I think it was, something like that is what I've seen has been recorded.
But there's a sense of, that I pick up of being desperate to make up for lost time.
Yeah.
And also I think a lot of artists would have kind of settled on a style by that point. He was still experimenting.
Yeah.
In a way that probably an artist 10 years younger would have been experimenting.
Yeah.
So there are influences of cubism, kineticism, lots of different things in this melting pot. So he's producing lots of different kinds of work.
Mm-hmm. He was involved in some of the groups that would have been around Liverpool at that time as well. He was involved in like the Liverpool Academy of Arts, which was a thing at that point. Obviously, it's not there now. But I've got something here. This is from the 1958 Open Exhibition, which was at Liverpool, and this is interesting. This was written by a critic at the time who was reviewing the exhibition. With regards to what I was saying before about the outward-looking nature of Liverpool, I find it interesting that this comment that I'll read now is when George was actually there, possibly being one of the people, the reason that it was being pushed in that direction, more outward-looking. And I'll read it to you now, and it says, it's 1950. So with regards to, it's at the Walker Gallery. Its 1958 Open Exhibition in the Walker Art Gallery is indeed a livelier show than any of our other provincial academies have produced for decades. It shows an awareness of what is going on in the international art world, which is not confined to one or two painters, but which seems to have acted as a stimulant to nearly all of the exhibitors. There you go. The dull conventional painting, which predominates in most provincial art societies, has been almost entirely excluded. And if, on the other hand, there is a certain proportion of somewhat brash and crude experimental in modernism, this at least has the merit of being alive. So yeah, I just thought that was quite an interesting thing. And that was like 1958. And in that same article, it does talk about some works being acquired for the collection, which is the John. Well, I'll read this now to see now. It says, under the terms of a special offer by Mr. John Moores, a panel of selectors has purchased 6 works, which Mr. Moores intends to present to the Walker Art Gallery for loan to schools and other public buildings. The works which have been bought are, and the first one is Water Over Stones, which is a watercolour by George Mayer-Marton. So there you go. And obviously a few other works there, including, I mean, some of the other people he must have associated at that point are people like Arthur Ballard, Nicholas Horsfield, and sort of some of the names in Liverpool at that point, because, it was an interesting time in Liverpool. Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah, in fact, I was looking at the Water Over Stones picture the other day.
Oh, right, okay.
I was in touch with the Walker, but that's by the by. There's a big collection of oils in the Victoria Gallery in Liverpool, yes. A lot of which were donated by George's girlfriend, Wendy Moran.
Right, I did notice that, yeah. There was a Wendy. I was going to ask you who that was.
I don't know exactly who she was. I mean, someone said she was a violinist, but I've never seen any actual evidence for that. But she was about sort of nearly 30 years younger than him.
Yeah.
And I think he met her sort of more or less straight after his wife died.
Right.
But, he hadn't been living with his wife for 11 years. And I think probably various girlfriends happened in the meantime. But I don't know. But I don't know who they were.
I did mention that to Peter Davis actually recently when we were talking about this, and I think he'd met Wendy as well at some point. He'd actually met her. I'm assuming when he was researching the book, he must have perhaps he met her. I'm not sure when she died or whatever, but at some point I think he said he did. He seems to have a memory of meeting her.
I met her when I was 9 months old, but I have no memory of that.
Well, there you go. Well, of course, we didn't mention the fact that you yourself actually have no memory, of course, of George, because you were a baby, weren't you, when he died?
Yes, he shuffled off as I shuffled on.
Yeah, 1960. There you go. That ages you. So there you go. So, of course, in Liverpool, he set up this mural class, which we mentioned earlier on, which was the first of its kind in the country. And then he worked on various mural commissions for churches and schools. And I think there was a public building possibly as well, somewhere along the way. But he wasn't religious, was he? I don't believe. Is that right?
I don't think so. I mean, I would say he's probably spiritual. And maybe slightly mystical in some way, but also with a very kind of clear and rational intellect. So I personally don't believe that he would have believed in any kind of literal sense in the dogma of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But, I've talked to a pupil of his, Gordon Miller, who sadly died quite recently. And he gave quite an interesting analysis of just how far George would have entered into those religious and spiritual themes. And Gordon worked with George on one or two of the mosaics, in fact.
Yeah, right. Okay, I didn't realize he died. He died recently, because there's a talk somewhere with him where you can hear him talk about the time that he spent with him. That's interesting. Does any of the work in the schools actually survive? That was a question I wanted to ask you actually, because I know he did actually murals in schools, didn't he? I think. Does any of it survive at all?
Not that I've been able to establish them. Quite honestly, my energies have been sort of too thinly spread.
Yeah.
Just save the mural in Oldham.
Of course, yeah.
I think some of them may have been destroyed. Some of them may have been overpainted.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I wonder if the actual buildings themselves are still there and they're just overpainted, and then that's a whole another route. I think one thing that we'll to comment on is that there's probably loads more to be done, isn't there? Loads more research and loads more things can be found out and discovered about him, I think, as well. There's sort of probably information out there to be sort of still learned, really, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose ideally I would sort of chase down at least one of these schools. I know the building is still standing because they use it for film shoots,
right?
But it's not visible any longer,
right? Okay.
I think that's one for another day. Realistically, obviously a lot of my time is taken up with George, but he's not a well-known figure in this country. He's much better known in Vienna.
Yeah.
But the problem for me is that his career is sort of bisected, and the early part of it, is gutted by fire.
Yeah.
Better word. So all that really exists of his oil painting was done in this country.
Yeah.
But I would say that the art establishment in London really doesn't take any notice of him at this point.
Yeah.
So, he falls between two stools because his work is primarily here, but his reputation is primarily in Vienna. So
That's interesting. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I get that. I understand. So we were talking about more like his commissions, and we did these school buildings and stuff. And then now we'll move on to the one in Oldham, if that's okay, which is at Fitton Hill, as I know it, which I think is it the Holy Rosary, I think it was called, which was done in sort of 1954, 1955.
That's right.
And that's a really interesting, incredibly beautiful masterpiece work, that as people sort of term it with regards to George's work, because it contains a fresco on either side of the central mosaic crucifixion, the fresco being Mary and John, and it's just stunning. From the photographs I've seen, ridiculously, I've never seen it, but there you go. But yeah, so do you want to pick up the story as to how you sort of heard of, I mean, I'm assuming you knew it was there, but when did you become more involved in it?
Well, yeah, rather foolishly, I thought after my mother had saved this Pentecost mosaic back in the 1980s.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, well, at least we can breathe a sigh of relief. Nothing else is under threat.
Yeah.
So there are 3 ecclesiastical murals, one in Blakely, one in Oldham, and the one that was transferred to Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral. And then in late 2016, I got an email from Steve Haynes, who was a former parishioner of Church of the Holy Rosary, saying that the building was under threat.
Right.
And I had this terrible sort of sinking feeling, here we go again. So I wrote a very nice, entreating letter to the bishop, at least I thought it was nice, saying how terrible it would be if this building were demolished.
Yeah.
Basically, they weren't interested. They were adopting what I would call a pretty Philistine approach to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Fortunately, my mother had a series of professional photographs done of the mural before it was overpainted, because the local parish priest took upon himself in the mid 1980s to paint the fresco element of the mural with domestic emulsion paint.
It's unbelievable that.
In Magnolia. The church at that time didn't have many controls over what the parish priest did with the church property.
Yeah.
So basically, because we were able to demonstrate what was underneath the paint, we eventually managed to get it listed.
Right.
That ended last year, so it was a kind of 6-year campaign.
That's amazing that you managed to do that. I know I saw so much, there's a lot of press coverage around your you sort of trying to do that along the way, and all the different sort of things that you were trying to, and you had some really important people as well, didn't you, sort of championing it and saying it was such an important work. You've got quotes from various directors of big institutions and things, I think, along the way, which I'm assuming helped.
It gathered a lot of momentum along the way, and we had support from the V&A, from the Belvedere Gallery in Vienna, from the Hungarian National Gallery, from the Victoria Gallery in Liverpool, the Imperial War Museum, a whole bunch of important institutions.
Yeah.
So it certainly made me feel by the end of the process that it was a very worthwhile thing to do, because this was a very important work.
Yeah.
And that he somehow managed to reestablish himself in this country in a completely different and unexpected idiom.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, was it a few years, wasn't it? I think overall, from you sort of first learning about it to it being listed.
Yes, yes, it's from late 2016 till July 2022.
Right, incredible. But no, so it's actually the mosaic and the mural, the fresco that is listed. The building itself isn't it?
The building is listed.
Right. Okay. So
the reason for that, which I became more aware of as we went on, is that a mural is, in aesthetic and artistic terms, seen as part of the building.
Okay.
Is conceived for a particular space.
Right.
So however good the space in Liverpool Cathedral is, it doesn't quite work in that alcove that it's in. It's great. I'm not complaining about it, but it's very different where it's conceived as what they call a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, which is one of the themes coming out of his Viennese background.
Yeah.
People like Klimt, for example, the Beethoven frieze in Vienna. And again, this is something I learned more about as I went on, because I had no idea that that's what this work was, but it's pretty clear that it was. and I have Professor Claire Wilston of Glasgow University to thank for that.
So the work is now listed. The building is now listed. Does that offer it some sort of protection now? Is that sort of what happens to what is the sort of what's the next stage with it? Are you done with it now? Have you had enough? Is there more to be done? What's going to happen with the building for starters, and etc. etc.
There's not much more I can do. It's really up to the church, and also the Hungarian community in Manchester are interested in trying to find a use for the building.
Right. Okay.
They're doing a feasibility study, and I'm just standing back for the moment.
Yeah.
The mural was vandalized straight after the listing twice.
Gosh.
The security measures put in place by the diocese were inadequate.
All right.
And I have to say, I kind of lost my temper with them a bit at that point.
Yeah.
Which I'm not ashamed of. So hopefully they will find a use for the building, and that's the only real guarantee of the future of the mural.
Yeah, that's it. That's what happens with these things, isn't it? Certainly with churches and things, if they do, if they run into problems along the way, or if something happens, or if the congregation declines or whatever, and they have to close, then it's finding uses for these buildings, isn't it? It can be tricky. It can be a tricky sort.
It's a paradox, really, isn't it? Because you would think that something fixed to a wall would be more permanent than a piece of movable art.
Absolutely.
Like the opposite is true, because people get tired of buildings and want to do something different with the land.
Yeah. This is true. No, I think it's a very honourable thing that you did, and you should be very proud of yourself, to be honest with you. And hopefully, they do find a use for it in some capacity. I would absolutely love to visit at some point. I don't know whether they ever do heritage open weekends there or anything like that. I'll have to try and see. I'll have to see what I can do.
Well, actually, Save Britain's Heritage, who were instrumental in the campaign.
Yeah.
Were a very important factor. They organised a visit last year.
Okay.
So you can still see the mosaic element, albeit vandalised.
Yes.
And it's quite an impressive. It's on an impressive scale.
Yeah.
But hopefully one day the thing will be restored, and it's actually not expensive to restore the fresco.
Is it not? That's interesting. Yeah, there is obviously you'd have some professional people to do it, but yeah, if it is just simply maybe an emulsion water-based paint or something like that, maybe it's not I
think essentially they can use a paint stripper.
Right.
I don't think they say that precisely.
They'll have some fancy word for it. They'll be there with the little cotton buds and stuff, and then as soon as you've turned the back, they get out the big cloths and stuff and start wiping it off.
Yeah, and you have to have someone say you've missed a bit.
So you've never seen it as it was then, have you? I'm assuming.
I've never seen it, no. Oh. So I hope I live long enough to see that.
Yeah, that'll be something. But from the photograph is stunning. It just looks like wow. It's a showstopper. And we'll move on now quickly then to another work, which is the Blakely one, which is the one he did in 1958. Now that's actually one that's still in a building in a church, St Clair's in Blakely. Oh, not Blackley as some people might refer to it. By the way, if you're from down south, you might call it Blackley. It's Blakely.
I've learned that the hard way.
Yeah, that's it. Anyway, in Blakely at St Clair's, and I've got family connections with that church because my parents were actually married there in the early 70s. Right. When they were very young, they were sort of 18 or whatever. They got married, still together, and then and my brother, I believe, I'm pretty sure about this, was actually baptized in the font, which was made, not even just designed. He actually made it hands-on. This is the thing with artists who perhaps have designed something, they've not necessarily always touched it and done, but he did. He's there, he's doing the mosaics, he's actually sticking them on and putting the tessera into place. So yeah, anyway, my brother would have been baptized in there at some point in the early 70s as well.
History comes full circle.
And I visited quite recently actually. I visited the I went to see, and I mean I've obviously been to the church in the past, but not for a while. It's not my local church, and so I drove there, and yeah, I stayed behind after, and they let me take a few like photographs and whatnot. So it was nice. It was nice to see it, and it is a huge. Again, that's just purely a mosaic. The work of the St Clair, and then obviously you've got the font at the bottom there, and but it is something that's in use as a church, and it's well kept and maintained, and that's nice. It's being used for the same purpose it would have been done when it was made.
And also, the church there is a wonderful space, and I think it's a very uplifting space.
Yeah, it's huge, isn't it? It's a huge
Yeah,
place.
I don't have a sense that place is under threat.
No, no.
Whereas, to be fair, the Holy Rosary is quite a dark space. It's a completely different aesthetic.
Yeah,
It's sort of quite an intense kind of brooding feeling about it.
The St. Clair's. When I read somewhere that was there something that he was going to do outside the church as well? Was there possibly going to do more work on that piece?
There were the various panels outside, but
Right.
they didn't weather well, so eventually they were taken down because they couldn't be restored.
Ah, right. Okay, so
I don't have
were
a
there?
huge amount of information about that, but I have got black and white photographs of them.
Oh, that's interesting. Right. Okay.
To be perfectly honest, I don't think they were that great, and I don't think the font was that great. If you want to see a really amazing font, the very first mosaic that he did in this country was at Tettenhall in the West Midlands, which is absolutely amazing.
Right.
But that's in a Protestant church.
Right. And that's still there, is it? That's still there.
Yeah, I'll send you a picture offline.
Yeah. I mean, sort of his fonts are interesting because he really expresses himself on his fonts. You can sort of feel like he's letting himself go a little bit. And I've sat on the Gaudi Serpentine bench in Barcelona, on the mosaics there and stuff. And I'm like, you sort of get that feeling a little bit that he is sort of being a bit more expressive in the fonts. They're quite interesting. The designs.
Yeah, there's this sort of playful element that comes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I think they are.
And there was also a mural he did for Coastal Lines. I don't know what's happened to that. I think it must have been destroyed or overpainted. But that's in Liverpool, and that's got very much the same idiom.
There's Wolverhampton as well, isn't there? Is that the?
That's the one in Tettenhall. Yeah.
That's the Tattenhall one, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then there's another one that I did read somewhere. I did come across some of it. Is it Beaconsall or something like that? Isn't there something there?
Barnoldswick.
Barnoldswick, that's it. Yeah. That looks like a little small church, that, doesn't it?
It's actually not that small, and I went there probably 3 or 4 years ago. Saw it for the first time. There is some kind of mystery about what happened at the end of George's life, because some of these works were finished off by a pupil.
Right.
Various fingers have been pointed because a lot of these sketches for unfinished works disappeared from his house at the time of his death.
Okay.
And I can't really work out whether the one in Barnoldswick is genuine or not. It's clearly to his design, but I'm not sure the execution is quite up to his standard.
Right.
There's also another series of mosaics in Sheffield, which again,
not sure,
clearly follow the design. And there's one design actually in the church, but the execution is just not on the same level.
Well, the Barnoldswick one, I did find an article about that from sort of around the time it was the church was built, and he does mention George Mayer-Marton with regards to the fonts, and it also mentions it mentions mosaics on the actual altar, because the actual altar of the church, there's mosaics on that, and I think it links Mayer-Marton to that, whether or not they are. But like I say, this is in a contemporary article from the time, so I thought that. So
I've seen the article. All I'm really saying is I have my reservations about it.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
And I think there's a little bit of a mystery there, which will probably never be solved.
Yeah.
But, what I do know is that the 3 ecclesiastical mosaics, apart from those 2 that I've mentioned, they are, genuine works by him.
Of course, yeah. Did he know, I mean, you might not know this, do you know of a guy called Eric Newton? Eric Newton was a mosaic artist who was born in Manchester in 1893. There's actually a really good example in Rochdale, and if you have a look online, you'll see it. It's just recently been restored, and it was perhaps more traditional mosaics, but he was interested in that. He had family connections from a Jewish family connections, Oppenheimer, who I think were some sort of mosaic manufacturers. So these connections. So I just wondered because he was kind of in similar sort of time. He also studied in Ravenna and Venice and Rome in 1914, studying Byzantine mosaics. And this is an interesting possible connection. It might be, it's interesting to talk about these connections and stuff. But the church that's the Fitton Church that we've been talking about, the Fitton Hill Church, there's a very much similar style church made by the same architects, which is in Middleton, which is like where I am, which is called Our Ladies, and it was by the same architect. And I think it was on the end of 1950s is when that was built. That's a huge church that called Our Ladies, and that's got the whole end of it is mosaics. Now I've not actually done any more research into that, but they look more like Eric Newton mosaics than George's. For starters, they've got titles of the saints above the names, which I don't think George would necessarily have done. But I just think, but it's just because I thought it was interesting with the connections of the architects and the work. The actual churches look similar as well. But yeah, you'll have to Google them anyway and have a look.
Yeah, I think I've seen the Rochdale mosaics online.
Right, okay.
I didn't know the connection with Mr. Newton.
Yeah.
So my mother always claimed that this was the first use of Byzantine mosaic in the UK.
Right.
But clearly that is open to question.
Yeah.
So I think the thing about the older mural is that you have a very interesting fusion of a Byzantine quality with the Renaissance element of the fresco.
Absolutely.
You've got these two sort of things coexisting, and maybe there's some kind of script there going on, which I can't fathom. But
yeah, no, it's a stunning thing. I'd love to see it like restored and back to as it was. I mean, just in the north of England, sort of around where I sit now, there are some interesting church, works in churches. It's amazing, when you sort of do read into it a bit more. Obviously, you've got your George's works, but then there's a huge Geoffrey Clark sculpture, who was a 20th century sculptor who's got work in like Coventry Cathedral and stuff like that, and it's literally about 5-10 minutes away from where I live, and that was sort of post-war, and it's this great big aluminium crucifix. It's incredible striking thing. And then there's work in Royton, which again is not far from me, by an artist called Arthur Dooley, who was in Liverpool as well. He might have just been after George's time there, but he did a crucifixion. I think it's been lent to the church in Royton from the Oldham collection. But it's just interesting that these works, dotted around these churches. You could really do a tour. You could actually do a tour.
In fact, Save Britain's Heritage did a tour of the Oldham mural and Geoffrey Clark at the same time, and also St Clair's in Blakely.
Right, okay. I must have missed that.
I didn't manage to get to the Geoffrey Clark one, but it looked like very powerful work. Oh,
it's incredible. I mean, but that church itself has recently, within the last couple of years, been listed because of the fact that they've been struggling with the roof. Right. It's so expensive. Once it's a bit of a cliche, but a church roof, and literally, I'd go in and they had like buckets on the floor and stuff, and it was just like, and it's such a shame. But then at the end of it, you've got this incredible sculpture, this world class sort of. It's about 40 feet high. It's just awe inspiring when you see it. It's incredible. But yeah, it's all interesting sort of stuff. I mean, to sort of I suppose, I mean, obviously there's more to say, but you did a book. Can we talk about the book? You did a little tiny book.
I didn't do it. Robert Waterhouse of Backey Press did the book, and I contributed a sort of introduction on a kind of personal level.
Yeah.
But there were some quite interesting pieces, including one by Professor Willsden, some writing by Robert himself, and it just concentrates on the murals and mosaics.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've got as soon as it came out, because it only came out. I think it might have been sold out now. The copies. I'm not sure if you can actually get them that easily now. But I'm not 100%.
I think there are going to be some more available, so I'll see if I can.
Yeah. No, I definitely have got a copy. In fact, I can show you on the screen now. Look, it's there.
I believe you.
You believe me. But yeah, it's a tiny little book, but it's just packed with. I mean, the most interesting thing about it for me, as well as obviously the essays and stuff, is the photographs. It's some incredible photographs. It's a really interesting little. It's a tiny book, but it's just it's stunning, and hopefully, whether that's in years to come or whatever, there will be something else. There'll be something, a bigger book written about him, and whether you're involved in that or something along the way. I don't know if you've even ever thought of that, or I don't know.
Yeah, I'm thinking of writing something, but obviously because I'm not an art historian, there are limits to what I can do. But I think probably what I would like to do is the sort of life in pictures, and try and sort of trace his development as an artist through his biography. And then, there's probably no market for a commercial book, but I will probably just try and write something which I can make available to people who are interested.
I think that's what it is. I think that's what it's about. It's just about getting it documented and getting the information there. These things are sort of important and to do that. And of course, he was in the Safe Haven book as well, which was another interesting book. He was featured in that, which is and as I mentioned before, he's in the Peter Davis book and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, about a year ago as well, he was on the Antique Roadshow. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah. All my older friends, sort of, the email started buzzing. I don't normally watch it,
Right?
And so that was fun.
That was good.
I wanted to get in touch with the owners of the painting because there was quite a nice story behind it.
But yeah, well, I was on the Antique Roadshow. I was on it myself. Quite the 100th anniversary show, which was shown, for the BBC for the 100th anniversary. So I went with a friend and we took a painting. There's a bit of a story behind it, but anyway, you can. I'm on the iPlayer. You can see me. You can see me on that. The first on the actual episode, actually, with a friend of mine. We went down to London and it was really Alexandra Palace actually is where it was filmed. Yeah, that's where we went for the day. So it was good.
Did you manage to suppress your enthusiasm when they told you how much it was worth? I know more than them. I'm not just saying that, about the artists that we went for. It was more just to show and sort of make a point. It's like sort of like you promoting it, that's what it's about for me. Sort of talking about the artist that we took to. We wanted to. His name was Harry Rutherford, and we wanted to sort of get him on. And he had links with the BBC in the early part of the BBC. Anyway, that's a whole other story. Don't worry about that. But yeah, this has been amazing, and it's George did have a particularly hard life, as we've described, an incredibly difficult life, and a lot of tragedy along the way. And yeah, it's just starting off from the early days of his work and being obviously leaving his home country, coming here, losing his work, obviously what happened with his wife and things like that, and eventually settling in Liverpool and being able to produce a body of work. And like you say, there is works in public collections, so hopefully, onwards and upwards with that, and there's more exhibitions in the future, and that's the dream, isn't it, I suppose? Yeah, I mean, one thing I should mention is that we're hoping there's going to be an exhibition at Liverpool College of Art.
Okay.
In the next few years, maybe 2025, 2026.
Right, excellent.
Which is in early stages of discussion at the moment.
Yeah.
But the sort of theme that we've been talking about for that is, which links in, I think, with the crucifixion mural, is that is a story of resilience and resurgence.
Yeah.
And the story of his time in Liverpool is someone who managed to sort of raise himself up from the ashes of his life.
Yeah.
And achieve something significant.
Definitely. No, yeah. I think you're right. So thank you today. It's been really interesting, and it's something I've wanted to do for a while. And I mean, it was ages ago when I contacted you initially. Honestly, it's ridiculous. In fact, I think I contacted you at the end of 2021, and I said I'll speak to you in the new year, and it was actually the new year 2023 when I contacted you. So it was kind of true, but
yeah, but you didn't say which new year, did you?
Exactly. But thank you for doing this, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Keep up the good work with it. Is all I can say, and it's amazing what you do, and I mean, I love his work, and I'll send you that thing about Picasso. I'll send you the thing on that so you can have a look at it.
I'd be really interested. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that.
Okay, no problem. All right, take care, Nick, and have a nice evening.
Thank you, and you.
All right, take care, mate.
Bye.
I really enjoyed the episode and learning a lot more about George's work. You can check out the website and see a bit more, which is Mayer-Marton.com. There's loads of information on there. His work is in quite a lot of public collections around the UK as well, so hopefully more is exhibited and shown. I mean, he's got work all over, really, including like the Victoria Gallery in Liverpool, which we did mention, but in the British Museum in London, the Ben Yore, Ashmolean in Oxford, the V&A in London, Walker Gallery in Liverpool. There's a lot of work out there, so yeah, hopefully more of it is shown. In fact, after this episode was recorded, an oil painting of George's came up for sale at auction in Vienna. It was dated from 1933, and it's extremely rare because not many oil paintings really survive of George's from pre-war, and barely any at all really, so yeah, it was quite an interesting thing. It featured the Amalfi Coast, and it went for quite a high price really as well, so yeah, I'll post an image of that as well on my Instagram at some point. So yeah, there you go. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. As usual, I'll post some images relating to the episode on the Northern Art Facebook page and on the Instagram page too. Any likes, comments, shares, messages, follows, anything like that is very much appreciated. You can also subscribe to the channel on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts, and then you won't miss out on any episodes I upload in the future.